Okay. Okay, thank you. I'd like to know, is there anybody at any of the off-sites? So I need to know whether I'm talking to anyone off-site or if I'm just talking to people here. Anybody off-site want to say something? Okay. 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 Well, I'll focus on you folks. I don't hear much from the other sites. But if there's anyone on the other sites that have a question or anything, just holler. I don't know whether we can hear it clear from where you're at, but hopefully the connections will be such, or you may just throw something at the screen, and maybe that'll get our attention too. For the audience that's here, please feel free to stop me, ask questions as I go through. I'm going to do three things today. I want to give you a little bit of data on the demographics of aging, why aging is going to be important. I make the argument that I think that this century that we're in, the 21st century, is going to be a century where in 100 years when we look back on it, that we're going to be looking at aging research, and what we've done with respect to aging is going to be one of our important contributions. We don't think of it now, but remember, 100 years ago, 1900, people weren't talking about cancer being important or genes. They didn't know what genes were. It wasn't until 1940 that people knew what genes were. People in 1900 were worried about things like pneumonia, diphtheria, consumption, which I'm not sure what consumption is, you know, but these were the major problems. So there's going to be major advances, and I look at the next this century, the advances are going to be that are going to have a major impact, both from a health standpoint, but certainly from a society standpoint, is aging and probably neurobiology. These are two areas that we know very little bit about, and we're going to have a major effect. Now, why? Why are we going to do this? Well, the first shows a little bit of demographics data. Is on the right-hand or the, I guess, left-hand side, you can see what's happened with respect to the population growth from 1930 up to the current time. And there's been an increase from about 7 million up to over 30 million. Okay, that does show on the slide. The most important thing is that what do the demographers tell us that's going to happen in the next 50 years? And you're going to see is this increase in population growth is going to occur even more rapidly. So that in the next 50 years, we're going to find that there's going to be an increase from of 50 million, from about a little over 30 million to a little over 80 million. And that's going to be happening not only in the 65 over population, this increase, but the 75 over population. Well, this is a national trend. So how does the national trend compare to Texas, and for a little parochial, what happens with respect to San Antonio? And you can see by these slides is that ultimately the changes are roughly similar. In other words, there's going to be an increase in the number of elderly, not only in Texas, but in San Antonio. And you can see this is probably for almost all communities. It would be relatively unusual not to see this increase. The most important thing, there is one difference between Texas and the nation, in the sense that Texas is relatively a young population, and so what happens is in the next 30 years, the 65 and over population nationally will increase 100%. In Texas, it's going to increase 300%. So this increase in the number of elderly is going to be more dramatic in the state of Texas than other parts. Currently, Texas ranks 4th in the nation in the number of elderly. And that ranking, of course, is going to increase in the future from the population growth and this growth in the number. Not only are the numbers increasing, but the distribution of the population is changing dramatically. This shows the distribution by age of the population in 1900, and this is about 100 years later in 1999. You can see in 1900, the majority of the population actually was under 24 years of age. You're going to find the very high levels in not only infants, but in teenagers as well as young people. We're going to see at the current time, we're going to find that there's been a major increase in the number of population, percent of the population that's over 35 years of age. And the most rapidly growing portion of the population, of course, is the 65 and older. And actually, if you go farther, if you look at the fold increase, it's going to grow. The increase over the past years and projected is higher for the 75-year-older, 80-year-older, 100-year-older. The most rapidly growing fraction of the population is the very old population. Okay, we can see if we look at the elderly as a percent of the population, and this is again 65 and older, we can see in 1900 it was about 6%. 70 years later it had increased slightly to 10% of the population was over 65 years of age. And we can see that in the next 70 years it's going to jump up to 30%. It's been projected that by year 2050, approximately 25% of the population will be over 65 years of age. Now, you might ask is, how accurate are these projections? The good news is that the demographers and the epidemiologists that have been making these projections have been consistently wrong for the last 30 years. That's the good news. The bad news is that their projections have always been an underestimate. So what I'm saying here is that these projections are probably conservative because they're based upon the health care that we currently have in the population. And so as the health care improves, the number of elderly is going to improve as well. Now, one other thing that I want to talk about with respect to changes in the population is the racial and ethnic composition. Currently, we're going to find that the non-Hispanic whites make up the overwhelming majority of the elderly population in the United States. 85% of the elderly are non-Hispanic whites. By 2050, we're going to see there's going to be a major shift here where still the majority is going to be non-Hispanic whites, but about two-thirds will be non-Hispanic white. And a third are going to be other ethnic populations. And we can see the biggest change here is going to be in the percent of change in elderly Hispanics. It's going to go from about 5% up to 16%. In other words, almost a threefold increase in the fraction of the population that's Hispanic. And this, of course, is going to have a major effect with respect to Texas and San Antonio because we have already a high Hispanic population. For example, in San Antonio right now, approximately 37% of the elderly population are Hispanic. This is the largest, actually, percent Hispanics of any metropolitan area. Okay. Now, so I've made the case that there's going to be a continued dramatic increase in the number of elderly. Not only numbers, but the percent of the population that's elderly. Now, why do we see this growth? Is it because people are aging more slowly? In other words, do we have more older people around because we're actually doing something about the aging process? Well, we can see that the number of elderly are increasing for two reasons. One, of course, there's more people in the world, but the other thing is that the people are living longer than they have before. And you can see in 1900, the average life expectancy at birth was for women 48 years of age and for men 47 years of age. And we can see that in this century that we've just finished, that this increase in life expectancy has increased to almost 80 years. In fact, currently for women, it is now. Female infants that are born now have a life expectancy of over 80 years of age. Men are still trailing, and men have trailed throughout. And there's a lot of speculation why men have a shorter life expectancy than women. My bias is that I think women evolved with a better system than men because they had to go through childbirth. And so that if you factor out the problems with childbirth here in the survival, you're going to find that women are going to have a stronger constitution than men. But that's my belief. But certainly we see this in men. Generally, in other animal models, it's not uncommon to see females live longer, although not always. It can vary greatly. So one of the things that has gone unnoticed this past century is this marked increase in life expectancy. Because if you go back in previous history, there was a slight increase in life expectancy in the previous century, in the 1800s. But before that, the life expectancy of humans was almost the same. And so we've had a major effect on the life expectancy in this past century. Now, why are we living longer? Again, I had said, is this because we're aging more slowly? Is this why? Well, we don't believe that's the case, because if we look at the survival curves here, and the survival curves show the number of survivors versus the age, so that you start out here with, at birth, you have 100% everyone's born here, and then with increasing age, you have individuals that are dying. You can see in the 1700s, and this is a kind of survival curve you would have probably is there was a high infant mortality rate, and then things kind of calmed down. And so what you see is that from 1700 to 19, slight improvement in, but it's primarily been because of the decrease in infant mortality rate. And then in the next few years, what we've seen is that there's been a squaring of the curve. And this is 1950, but if we would look at the current time, there wouldn't be much difference. The curve would be just shifted a little bit. Now, what's happened is the reason we're living longer is because we have, of course, decreased dramatically infant mortality, which would have a major effect on life expectancy. But in addition, we have improved health, cured infectious diseases, improved nutrition. Just think, 100 years ago, they really didn't know what vitamins were, you know, and so we've had a major impact. We haven't done anything with respect to age, because if you go back and look at the maximum, that's what usually gerontologists view. In other words, if you affect aging, you expect to see it change here as well as the mean or the average changing. And we don't believe that we've had much of effect on the maximum. The maximum has been the same throughout history. It's just that we have more older people now because we have a larger population. Now, what is the maximum? Now, you folks have been sitting there very nicely watching. Does anybody have an idea of what is the oldest recorded, and notice here I say recorded age of an individual, that we know exactly how old they are, and the oldest that is, what number that is?
123, lady in France.
You got it close. You missed it by just 1 year. It's 120. This is the oldest reported case, is 122 years old. And again, she died relatively recent from France, a lady. And this was pretty exciting, because this is the first person that we know of that essentially broke 120. It was thought that the barrier was maybe around 120 years of age. There's a lot of interesting stories about her. The one story I like about her is that when she was in her, I think, 80s, yes, it was her late 80s, she had an apartment, kind of apartment house, a condominium, that an individual in his 60s wanted to purchase from her. And she said at the time she really didn't want to sell it because she wanted to stay in her apartment as long as she wanted to. But apparently it was hard to get housing then. And so he made a deal with her that he would essentially pay her a relatively small amount for the rest of her life, so that when she died, then he would automatically have the house. Now, as Paul Harvey tells, the rest of the story, of course, when she made this deal, she was in her late 80s. I mean, it looked like a good deal to him, because her average life expectancy of a person in their late 80s is only in the range of probably 7 to 8 years. And so he would have felt that he would get the house in 7 or 8 years. Well, subsequently, 20 years later, he passed away, and she was still alive. In her last years, actually, his family was supporting her in her last years. So this just shows that you can't always go by the statistics sometimes, but this is an interesting story. Certainly now it's very common, of course, to have centenarians. When I was growing up about 45, 50 years ago, somebody being 100 years of age was very, very unusual. Now it's still a little bit unusual, but it's not uncommon. What you're seeing now is that people are in their 110s. As I said, 120 is still very unusual, but my guess is that we're going to see that this is roughly, we're going to see probably, because of the number of people, there will be a few more. But again, this is probably nothing special. In other words, that this is probably somewhere around the maximum limit of what a human being can live if you have no effect on aging. Two other things I wanted to mention about this lady. One of the things that has always been a concern is of course, more recently, is Alzheimer's. In other words, the question is Alzheimer's something that's inevitable with aging? In other words, if you live long enough, will you eventually get Alzheimer's? Cataracts is a lot like that. In other words, everybody's going to have cataracts if you live long enough. And there's the question is this the same potential problem with Alzheimer's? Certainly this lady, there were a lot of testing. This lady, even at 122 years of age, was very sharp and didn't show any evidence of major problems. However, you should keep in mind is that certainly her last days, she was in a wheelchair. She lost a lot of her sight, hearing, and that sort of thing. They've always asked, well, what did she do for a long life? It's interesting. She smoked up to the last, I think, 15 or 20 years of age, or until her last 10 to 15 years, and she quit smoking not because of health reasons, but she couldn't see to light her cigarettes, and she was vain and didn't like to have other people light her cigarettes. And so that's kind of interesting. Maybe she could have gotten a couple more years if she hadn't smoked. I'm always interested that the cigarette manufacturers haven't come up and used her as a poster child and says, she smoked brand X and she lived to be 122. It's not a lie, But so as we look at it, as I pointed out, is that the maximum that we're talking about, even though this is showing kind of pooping out here around 95, probably the maximum we're talking about that someone can live. Most of the people will be dead by this time, but the maximum is probably out around 120 years of age. Okay. Now, the one thing that I want to emphasize here is that one of the things that we see with age is that there is a dramatic increase in the incidence of death as a function of age. And this is for almost everything. This is a very busy slide. I don't expect you to be able to look at it, but the impact here is that almost everything that you look at, the risk of dying from that increases dramatically with age. And what I mean by dramatically is what I've got is this is a semi-log plot. In other words, we have the age down here linearly, but on this case we have in the log scale the deaths, so that if we were actually looking at this plot, it would be a curve that would go up like this rather than a straight line. So this is very dramatic with age. If we look at in the last 100 years, if we look at, I'm not sure, can you folks hear me on the off-site? I see people on the off-site there at UTEP. Can you hear me? I don't know. They look they're just looking intently, so hopefully they can. But if you look at the 10 leading causes of deaths in 1900 versus at the present time, roughly 2000, it's very interesting. In 1900, we'll just go through the first 5 here, and I'll do that because I'm not sure whether the off-campus can see the slides very well. At the top of the list is pneumonia, influenza, second, tuberculosis, third, diarrhea, ulcers, etc., fourth, heart disease and stroke. And you go down there, cancer is number 8 on this list. Now, if you look at the current major killers, heart disease is at the top of the list, cancer is second. These outshine the rest. In other words, are about 4 times higher than the next. Then you have stroke, pulmonary diseases, pneumonia, influenza, accidents, and so on. And so it's very interesting is that what's killing the population, the major disease processes now are quite different than at the turn of the century. Now, this is very important because at the turn of the century it was primarily infectious diseases. And that's important because infectious diseases primarily affect everyone. Certainly younger and older individuals are going to be more susceptible, but I remember growing up as a kid listening to my grandparents talk about the big influenza epidemic in the early 1900s. That wiped out everybody, essentially. Currently, when we look at heart disease, cancer, even stroke, and these others, we're going to see these are diseases that are affecting one population, the elderly. In fact, if you look at heart disease, cancer, and stroke, all of these have there's the number one risk factor for all of these diseases is the same, and that's age. If you look at the incidence of cancer either in men or in women, you're going to see that before age 45, the incidence of cancer is relatively low. And after that, the incidence of cancer, and these are most cancers, there are certain cancers, of course, that are unique to infants and so on, but this is the overwhelming bulk of cancers. After age 45, the risk increases very dramatically in both men and women. You see the same thing for cardiovascular disease. In fact, it's much more dramatic, the changes. Early on, you see very little effect. Later on, you see a dramatic effect. Now, this is important because what happens is this is only affecting the elderly, and the important thing here is that when we eventually cure or can treat these diseases effectively, we're going to have much less of an effect on lifespan than we had earlier this century when we cured diseases. If there's one thing that I would like to have you get from this talk is this concept. In other words, there's going to be a major shift in the effectiveness of our strategy of treating health on the population compared to 100 years ago, because the diseases that we're looking at now are primarily related to aging. In fact, I would argue, and I think most scientists would believe that now, is that for both heart disease and cancer, age is a major factor in that process. Not the only factor, but I believe that if you were able to take a person that at 25 years of age and somehow magically stopped aging, you would not get heart disease and you would not get cancer. In other words, it's not just being around a long time, it's what's happening in the process of aging. Now, that's important from a society standpoint, because in 1900, when we were able to cure and prevent and treat infectious diseases by a variety of ways, we had a major impact on the quality of life. I go back to when I was a youngster, the polio epidemic was a big deal in the 50s. And certainly by treating that, you had a major impact on individuals, because instead of living out your life in an iron lung or being partially paralyzed, you would be essentially normal and be able to function normally. So you had a major effect on quality of life. Okay, let's say that we were able to, right today, cure heart disease and cancer. What would we get? It's been estimated that the average life expectancy would increase somewhere between 5 to 10 years. Now, 5 to 10 years is good, don't get me wrong, but what will it have on the quality of life? The problem here is if you have no effect on aging, instead of dying of heart disease, let's say at age 75, you then don't die of heart disease, but 2 years later you have Alzheimer's, you haven't had much of an impact on quality of life. Or if you have osteoporosis, or you can go through various disease. And even if you were able to come in and cure every disease, and the reason I'm emphasizing it is in our biomedical research, the way we look at having an impact on health status is we cure diseases. We go one disease after another. And that's what I'm trying to make a case is that was very effective back at the turn of the century. Now, if we just cure one disease at a time, we're not getting at the root cause aging. And so we don't have much of an impact on quality of life, even if we were able to prevent every disease. For example, that's what the French lady, Jeanne Calmet, she didn't die of any major diseases, but even in her case, she essentially lost her sight, lost hearing. You see, we call it frailty, but you see a loss of muscle mass and weakness so that people become very weak, so it's very hard for them to walk around or have the strength to move around. All of these things are associated with aging. And therefore, if we just cure one disease at a time, but don't really look at the aging process, we're not going to have had much of an effect on quality of life. And just as importantly, we really haven't had a major impact on the cost of health care necessarily. Because I've always joked with my colleagues who are studying cardiovascular diseases is that we shouldn't be spending money on this disease because this is a nice disease because it pretty well kills you very quickly. You don't have a lot of health care. And if you prevent this and then the person gets Alzheimer's, this is a tremendous disease with respect to health costs. Now that's a joke. Don't go away saying. But what I'm trying to do is emphasize, and as I said, this is the one thing that I want to get across, is that we haven't quite come to grips with the fact that we need to quit thinking solely about curing one disease at a time, and we've got to think that we're in a position now that we've got to think about doing something about the aging process. Now, you might, as I see it, there are several things that have held this area up, or aging up. When I started aging research, which was over 30 years ago, at that time, I think most people were kind of interested in it because throughout human lifetime, throughout the human history, people have been interested in two things: creating gold and having longevity, or looking for the fountain of youth, or whatever it may be. So there's always been that interest, but I think most people have kind of said, well, there's nothing you can do about it. And that's what 30 years ago when I got in this field, most of the people that I talked to were interested, but if you really got into their mind, they would say, well, that's interesting to do, and it's all right, Richardson, for you to do that, but you're not going to have really much of an effect. It's interesting that I've seen in the last 5 years, to a large extent in the population as a whole, people are beginning to say, why can't we do something about aging? And that's very important because there's got to be that mindset that we can do something about it. Because this is what happened in 1900 when cancer started coming on the scene. People kind of said, well, that's something we can't do anything. That's real complex. The same thing was thought about infectious diseases in the early 1800s. People said, well, that's just part of being human. You die from typhoid or this sort of thing. And suddenly people says, why can't we? Why do we have to put up with this? And that provided the impetus, combined with the scientists, to cure that. So you've got to have a desire from the public, which translates into the politicians, which translates into funding, so that people will say, yes, we need to be looking at aging. And I look at that, it's going to be happening in the next 5 to 10 years. It's already happening. And so that's going to put aging and looking for a solution to, or preventions or treatments or this sort of thing with respect to the aging process itself. Now, I want to spend just a few minutes to advertise a little bit about what we've got going here with respect to aging. It's interesting because aging is a new field of study, and so that although there are centers, it's common to have centers in various institutions institutions, usually these centers are relatively small, and so we don't have things like cancer centers, aging centers nearly as common as cancer centers, particularly at medical centers. Here at the University of Texas Health Science Center at San Antonio, we do have an Aging Research and Education Center. It was only established about 8 years ago, but currently we have more than 165 faculty involved in this center. And not only are they from the Health Science Center, but we also have from the VA hospital, we have Southwest Foundation, the University of Texas at San Antonio and Trinity. So we provide kind of an umbrella for scientists interested in various aspects of aging. The research in aging that's going on here at the Health Science Center goes everything from very basic research on genes to applied research where you're looking at the evaluation of processes or looking at functional status or whatever you may look at. So we have a wide range of research activities, and we have faculty from all 5 of the schools involved in the aging program. Currently, one way to kind of compare the aging research activity is to compare the grants from the National Institute on Aging. And if you look at the Texas, the University of the Health Science Center at San Antonio would rank tops in the state in the number of research grants. If you compare us to other medical centers throughout the country, we would rank second to Massachusetts General, which is associated with the Harvard University. Now, I want to just close, and I've got, what have I got, about 10 minutes? Or do I have less than that?
No, more.
More than 10 minutes, okay. Okay, well, I've got lots of slides. So you just, Lily, you just let me know when it's stopped, and I will stop. Okay. I want to talk a little bit now, kind of from a more research and science perspective, is what do we know about factors that influence longevity? And this is not rocket science. In fact, most of you probably, if I asked you to give a list, you'd come up with the same list. But we know that genetics are involved, lifestyle is involved, and environment. And all of these work together to impact longevity. And theoretically, you could affect longevity through any of these processes as well. First, let's look at genetics. Now, this slide here shows that I say 60 to 80% of longevity is genetically controlled. Now, that's probably a bias. That's my bias. And it depends on how you define genetically. I've also seen people that would argue that maybe only 20 to 40% of longevity is genetically controlled. Now, if you look at the human population and what we can do about what's comparing different groups of people, you're probably looking at less than 50%, probably less than 40%. You're talking about probably the window of 20 to 40% of human longevity, if you look at different groups and individuals, is genetically controlled. So it's very small. On the other hand, I would argue that if you look at a mouse and a human being, you're talking about a mouse which has an average life expectancy of 2 years, and a human being that has an average life expectancy of roughly about 80 years as being huge. And that's that difference there is not environment, that's genetics. They evolved, and the different genes are operating differently in these individuals. So it depends on what you're talking about when you talk about genes and how important they are. The one thing is certainly we know that genes will play a role. Now, these are some studies from nematodes. These are very small ground worms that you have, and they have been able to produce a stock of animals which they're called age 1, and these are a genetic mutation. They have a mutation in only one gene, and you can see if you look at the survival curve of these worms that they have a increased life expectancy compared to the parental stock, in other words, where you haven't mutated this gene. Only one gene has been changed here, so that if you look at the mean survival, you have roughly about a third increase in the extension. But most importantly, you know, what I talked about before, if you look at the maximum here, that's been increased. So that these worms, for all practical appearances, do appear to be living longer because they're aging more slowly. You see the same thing, same type of demonstration is made in Drosophila. These are fruit flies. These are up a little bit higher on the evolutionary scale, but again, you have the parental stock, and this is a group, another strain in which the only difference between the parental strain and this strain, which is called Methuselah because they live a long time, is that there has been a mutation in a single gene, and this mutation results in these flies living longer. So certainly in very primitive organisms, we certainly can see that we have an effect on the survival of the animals by modulating one gene. What about human beings? What do we know about genes? We know much less, but there are a few conditions where we do know that changes in one gene can have an effect. We're not here looking at increases in lifespan and reducing aging, but we're looking at the reverse. In other words, accelerating aging. And the first of these diseases is probably, you've seen something about this as you've gone through shopping at the grocery store. As you look at the Inquirer or something like that, usually about every 6 months they have an issue on the infant that's dying from aging. And this is a disease known as Hutchinson-Gilford's progeria, or usually just called progeria. But it's this type of accelerated aging where these individuals at birth appear normal. There's no difference in IQ in these individuals that have this genetic disease, but usually in the first to second year of life, the first thing they observe is that their growth is retarded. And what you see is that these individuals, while at birth they appeared normal, as they get older, they have many features of aging. Now, they've kind of dressed this individual up so that he does look older, but this would be an individual that's about 12 to 14 years of age, because that's usually the age that these individuals will die. They die usually before 14 years of age. They lose hair. Much of their skin has more of an elderly appearance. They have high incidence of diabetes. Generally, this is the individual, I think this was taken at his when he was 12 years of age, and he died shortly after this photograph. And usually the death is due to cardiovascular disease. Now, because of the appearance and many symptoms that are similar to aging, this has been viewed as a case where a gene that's causing accelerated aging. Now, this is not, the scientists now, or gerontologists, do not look at this as pure aging phenotype, because these individuals don't get everything that we see with older people. They don't show a higher incidence of cancer. They don't show Alzheimer's, or certainly they show cardiovascular diseases, so that they're showing a spectrum of cases. There's another genetic disease that from an aging standpoint people are more interested because it probably mimics aging much more. And these individuals do appear to be relatively old when they're relatively young. Again, these individuals when they're young appear normal. In fact, they appear normal until they get to the point of sexual maturity. And they're at that point when the growth spurt for other individuals increases markedly, their growth spurt doesn't, so that they're characterized by being small in stature. So this is this young lady as a teenager. This is this lady when she was 48 years of age. Usually these individuals die in their 50s and 60s. And they have all a lot of appearances of being older. So if you looked at those individuals, you would predict that this person was probably 30 or 40 years older than her actual age. Now, this disease is called Werner's syndrome, and this genetic disease is more like aging. And what I've shown here is the things that you see with Werner's and with aging. And you're seeing that most of the things that you see with aging, you also see with Werner's syndrome. In other words, you see graying and hair loss. You see atherosclerosis. You do see increased cancer. You see increased osteoporosis, diabetes, cataracts, and so on. But it's not 100%. For example, the pathologists tell us that even though they get more cancer, the type of cancer that people with Werner's syndrome get are different than aging. The other thing that's notably different is that with aging, oftentimes you see problems with neurodegeneration and Alzheimer's, and you don't see this with Werner's syndrome. So while Werner's syndrome is probably the best human example of accelerated aging, it certainly doesn't mimic it, the aging phenotype completely. So we certainly know in animal models where we can alter genes, we can affect how fast they age and how long they live. We also know there are genetic diseases that look like accelerated aging, and there's been a lot of interest because this gene has been identified and people are now trying to figure out what that gene does. We think that gene is involved in the repair of DNA, and so somehow this brings to light that somehow DNA damage may be important in aging, but we still really don't know how. Question? That could be, but nobody knows. The problem with this system is while they think the gene is involved in DNA repair by what its sequence, but they haven't really gone in and determined its absolute function. One of the things that's made this very difficult is that when they identified this gene in humans, they turned around and then made an animal model where this gene was knocked out or defective, and you would expect it should show the same phenotype as you see in humans. So they were expecting that they would get mice that would age more rapidly. Unfortunately, these mice don't age any differently, and so we don't know right now whether it's that this is unique to human beings or whether the mouse gene is different and this sort of thing. So this was really a hot area about 4 or 5 years ago when they identified the gene and they kind of thought what it was doing on its function. And now I think probably this gene, probably the thing that makes it unique is that it probably does a lot of things. Not only DNA repair, it might be involved in cell division as well as just gene expression. And so it could have a variety of effects as well. So there was, as I said, there was a lot of excitement in this area, and it hasn't quite panned out. Lily, where am I at time? Time to stop. Okay, then I will just end on the fact that not only are genetics important, but lifestyle and environment. And to give you an idea of lifestyle and environment, and these are studies that have been done here, is we've shown that with rodent models, either rats or mice, if we reduce the amount of calories, the food they consume, that these animals will live longer, both the mean survival and the maximum. And all of our studies here indicate that these animals are aging more slowly. The good news about this is the fact that these animals also that are aging more slowly appear to be healthy and healthier throughout their lifespan. So you aren't, by slowing down aging and having these long-lived animals, you aren't extending the period when they're morbid or independent or dependent. It seems like you've also improved the quality of life, and actually they're more active and have less problems than the other animals that are aging more rapidly. Stop there. Yes. Are there any questions either here or on the other site? Yes.
In countries where food is restricted because there just isn't the availability that we have in this country, this doesn't come out the same way.
Well,
is that because of the environmental?
Usually what happens is because you could make an argument that if you looked at the human populations and which populations live longer and how much they weighed. Actually, if you looked at our country, you would see that there's been this increase in how long we live, and if you plotted the average body weight, you'd also see that increase. Well, what happens is it's kind of a combination, is that if you look in those countries where there is limited food, you're going to see there's going to be problems with health care and disease, so that you don't have that. There's been a few studies, for example, in Japan, the island Okinawa, where these individuals have less diet, but it's apparently the same kind of lifestyle or the health care as the other, and they have relatively long lifespan. So there has been a question of whether this dietary restriction, which we do see in short-lived rodents, is relative to human populations. There are a few studies that they're doing this dietary restriction with non-human primates, monkeys, at Wisconsin and at National Institute on Aging. And the National Institute on Aging has the oldest study, and they show many of the same changes early on that we see in rodents. And they're now to the point where they have a few of the animals have started to die, and the amount of pathology appears to be reduced in the restricted animals compared to the ad lib animals. And so my guess is it will probably hold up. The big problem is that it's easy to do. This has to be lifetime restriction. I didn't mention that. But this is easy to do in rodents where you're just giving them the diet. This certainly is more difficult in a human population. And so really the research in this area is try to understand how this is working, and then we might be able to manipulate that process.
In relation to aging, I also know, like,
Oh, yes.
Longevity. Is it like toxic? Is it the air? What is it in the environment that they've identified?
They really haven't identified anything that would interact directly with the aging process. This is more or less of kind of a hypothesis. But we certainly know that things that probably toxic agents, maybe that aren't high enough, let's say, to have a major effect on disease, let's say in a short term, there's the belief, and again, there's not a lot of data, but there would be the feeling that being exposed to things over your lifetime, and generally it would probably be believed that agents that are causing oxidative damage might be very important. But to say one particular agent, we don't know. This is more kind of a hypothesis. Kind of makes sense, but no one has really done this to any extent. We kind of feel that there's probably a combination of factors, but I can't give you, it's not as nice, as neat as I can give you a few genes that we think that may be involved in aging, but I can't give you anything about compounds in the environment that might accelerate the aging process. That's more of a hypothesis. Good question. Any other questions, particularly off-site? You had a question here.
I was just asking about, I know there's studies being done about the metabolic rate, brain weight, body weight in relation to aging.
Yeah, that's a good question. There was an old, back in the 30s, it was called a study by Pearls, where they suggested that metabolic rate was important. So that the higher the metabolic rate, the faster you would age. And there is some evidence that if you look at, for example, if you look at the metabolic rate of a mouse and a human being, we know that the human lives longer, and the metabolic rate of the mouse is much higher. However, if you look at more and more animals, that breaks down. So it's not a hard and fast case. And the best example are birds. Birds are relatively long life for their size. Generally, the smaller you are, the shorter your lifespan is. And it probably has something to do with your survival in the wild. But certainly, if you look at, for example, as I said, a mouse has an average life expectancy about 8 years. If you look at a bat, which is actually roughly the same size, A bat has an average life expectancy of 8 years. If you look at a hummingbird, and I'm using a hummingbird as an example, because a hummingbird has the highest metabolic rate of any organism we know. It has a higher body temperature, has higher blood glucose. All of those things we would say, if we knew that an organism had all of these, we'd say that should age more rapidly. A hummingbird has an average life expectancy of about 8 years. So you have some birds like parrots that you're talking about 40 to 50 years. And so it's believed that the birds live longer because in other words, a mouse evolved with a very short life, because if you look in the wild, the mice are going to be dead by about 6 months of age. So that there's no reason to essentially develop genes and this thing that'll take you for 40 years if you're going to be killed within 2 to 3 months, let's say. On the other hand, birds, because they have wings and can get away from predators, they essentially evolved with genes that would give them longer life. And so that's a good example where something like metabolic rate, which kind of fits in some organisms, certainly the birds have escaped that process. Any other questions? Well, let me tell you this. Yes.
I have a suggestion.
Yes.
You know what, on the visuals, it's very hard to read them. Can they focus? The transparency?
It slides, and it may be the slides. We've had this problems with the slides in the past.
Camera's not on the slide, the camera's on you.
Okay, but if the camera were on the slides, you're saying, we've had this problem before. It's hard to see the slides, I think.
The larger the font, the easier it is to see.
Yeah, because the resolution. Yeah. Well, I can tell you this, is that the next speaker is going to be really good. I'm just the tune-up for this man.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson. And we're all still looking for that fountain of youth, so I know Dr. Richardson is working on that.
What goes up must come down. Spin